Hello, my name is Eibhlín Mulroe and I'm the CEO of Cancer Trials Ireland, and today is International Clinical Trials Day. It's the 20th of May every year, and it's a day where all of us involved in research come together in the cancer community and highlight and build awareness about the value of clinical trials. And I know we've done a lot of talking in local media in particular over the last week about what clinical trials mean, and also about today, because I'm joined by Professor Seamus O'Reilly, who is the clinical lead of Cancer Trials Ireland. You're very welcome.
Afternoon, everyone.
We're here in RCSI, where our home is based in Cancer Trials, and Seamus Cotter, a good friend of Cancer Trials Ireland now at this stage and a member of the Patient Consultants Committee. So we're very, very honoured to have you here with us to talk about your experience, Seamus, because you're from Ennis in County Clare.
Right.
And we met many years ago through our advocacy for trials in the west of Ireland and the importance of access to trials in the west of Ireland. And you told me your story about being on a clinical trial, and I'm going to hand it over to you and ask you just to let everybody know what happened to you and how we got here.
Okay, thanks, Eibhlín.
Thank you.
It was back in early 2016 when I initially got a bout of phlebitis, which is a swelling of the veins in the lower leg.
I was going to ask what's that.
Yeah, swelling of the veins in the lower leg. And my GP treated it with antibiotics. She said it was unusual because she described it as an old man's disease and that I really shouldn't be getting it. But unfortunately, it came back a couple of times. And each time it got progressively worse. I was sent to the medical assessment unit in Ennis. And there, eventually, one of the doctors put his hand on my collarbone and discovered that there was a swollen lymph node. So what they did was refer me for getting that biopsied. The biopsy itself didn't happen locally. My GP referred me to the Galway clinic, where I was brought in, assessed, and I was immediately admitted to the clinic because they did a CT scan, and the CT scan itself discovered that I had multiple clots on both my lungs.
And did you have any idea what you were going to hear? Like, did you know what the tests were going to find at that point, or?
Not particularly, no.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
Obviously, we were concerned about the path that we were I was starting on. My wife was obviously with me at all of the various steps we took.
Yeah.
But I stayed in the Galway clinic for the week while they treated the clots, as it was quite an urgent case to be looked after. They then, before I left, they looked after the lymph node. They took a biopsy and sent it off for testing. Just before I left, they said they suspect that I have some kind of cancer.
Yeah.
It's probably lymphoma, and if it is, not to worry. It's going to be easily treated, and I'll be on my way again.
Did you not worry when you heard that word? Or?
I really didn't.
Yeah.
You know, we went away. We had an appointment to come back in a couple of weeks' time to one of the oncologists, Paul Donlan, in Galway, and I was half expecting to be told, yes, you have cancer, and we'll follow a specific path, and it'll be quite easy.
Yeah, and there you were.
Yeah.
So Seamus, listening to that, we have two Seamuses here today, so I'm going to call you Professor O'Reilly. For once, I give you the proper title. So Professor O'Reilly, the whole idea of a clinical trial, can we get into that a little bit, and then we're going to come back to your story, Seamus. Yeah.
So cancer research makes cancer care. Yeah. And if we look at the beginning of cancer therapies almost 100 years ago, they were accidentally discovered. It was accidentally discovered because of side effects in the First World War and the Second World War. And refinement of those treatments have come from trials, from developing new agents, from comparing the old treatments with newer ones, and they also rely on building blocks of clinical research, of research in our laboratories, which have demonstrated, one of the questions that people always ask is, why me? What happened? And what happened is there was a change within a normal cell that made it a cancerous cell. And then often changes in the environment around that allowed it to develop. So that change that occurs in the cancer cell is what we look at in terms of targeting therapies, because it selects out the normal and the abnormal cell. And that's what trials are about. About refining existing treatments to make them safer, to make them more effective.
Yeah. And the way some people, you hear it in the media that some people fear clinical trials, like they think they're like a guinea pig.
Yes.
How do you counteract that question when you hear it in the clinic?
So I think that clinical trials are about trust. And there's a significant range of safeguards and monitoring in a trial before it can ever take place. We've learned, unfortunately, through history that these need to be put in place and rigorously implemented. So there's before a patient can have access to a clinical trial in Ireland, there's the National Research Ethics Committee, there's the HPRA who are also involved as well, and there are various also the funders and regulatory bodies that supervise our trials also have due diligence attached to them. For a trial to take place, for a doctor to enrol a patient on a trial, he has to have he or she has to have a question mark about whether this trial is better than the existing trial or not, or existing therapy or not, in order for the study to go ahead. You can't, if you don't believe that a new treatment could be better, or at least the same as the existing standard of care, it's not ethical to enrol the patient on the trial. So all of these safeguards are put in place to facilitate that. I think also there's also an awareness in the medical and the research community about trust. Trust is built gradually and destroyed quickly, and that it's very important that patients and our communities have trust in the system that's there. And so if there's a perception, either real or imagined, about the guinea pig aspect, that doesn't serve trust, and that erodes trust.
Absolutely. And having been through this journey myself recently, the trust your medical team is really important. And one thing I'd say from having worked in this sector is that I could do that, because of all of these regulatory obligations that are there in care as well as in clinical trials, and it's important. It's important to feel that as a patient, because you have so many questions. And I'm sure, Seamus, at the point where were asked about a clinical trial, they must have brought up a lot of questions in your head. Or were you comfortable to just go on the trial?
No,
how did it come about?
Yeah. Well, I suppose it came about initially. There's a little bit of a backstory to how it came about with me, because as you know, with the clinical trial, there's certain criteria that people have to meet to be accepted onto the trial, and others that will disclude you. One of the elements that I had was that in my 20s, I was diagnosed with and treated for colitis, which would have discluded me from that particular trial that was proposed. But to be fair to my oncologist, he said, okay, but you've given me your history. Your history hasn't actually shown any additional colitis symptoms or treatment since your 20s, because at that stage I was in my mid-40s. And so he sent me off for a colonoscopy, which could check the lining of the stomach. And that actually proved that I never really had colitis. So that was a step forward to allow me to go on the trial.
That's amazing. And is that, Seamus, Professor O'Reilly, is that, the screening piece in trials, it's not, everybody can't just go on a trial if they have a particular cancer.
No. The screening piece is about patient safety. Because with certain drugs they can unmask conditions, or they can create additional problems. So the screening piece is about making sure that patients aren't exposed to unacceptable risk in a trial. But one of the problems we have about the screening piece as well is that it may not reflect. It means that you might have a very selected patient who mightn't reflect the real world.
Yeah.
So now in trials like the ADEPT trial that Dr. Naidu is running, it's for patients who are frailer in an older demographic, which is more reflective of the real world. So I think that there's recognition in the medical community that that the results that we have from trials need to be externally relevant to patients. If the patient is Superman or Superwoman and does very well on the treatment, well, the reality for society is how would a normal person do?
Yeah, how does it translate, really?
Yes.
And it's very disappointing when you're a patient and, there's one, it could be your age. Some of our trials that we run with global groups, they don't want to see anyone over a certain age or under. Isn't that right? So
that's a problem. And cancer, the common stage for cancer is over 60. Age is your biggest risk factor for cancer. And I think there's recognition now in trials that they need to be more generalizable. We've seen that with COVID, where there was pragmatic trials which were had broader entry criteria, so it would be relevant in the real world. I also a comment at our cancer retreat. Ashley Bazin, who's the nurse manager of the unit in Tala, also made the point that when patients are screened for a study and it doesn't work out, it is devastating for the patient. And I think I thought her comment was very prescient. I thought it wasn't something that we really that we don't take as much consideration of in our work as we should. How upset, you're dealing with someone who's already vulnerable, and now
because the trial gives you so much hope, doesn't it?
Yes.
And we'll get to that now with you, Seamus. So when you got through the inclusion criteria and you thought, right, I'm going to get on this trial, did you feel that sense of hope?
I really did.
Yeah.
I really did, because this was back in 2016. At that point, for
that
advanced...
was such a different time, wasn't it, for immunotherapies
it
in
was,
particular?
yeah.
It was new, really, for us.
The standard of care for advanced lung cancer was chemotherapy. And the outcome from that would have been quite poor.
You were a trailblazer, Seamus, in this. You really were, when you think about in that context as well.
Not so much me, but the science and the medicine.
Yeah.
I was the beneficiary of that.
We can't do
those
it without you.
Yeah,
but it takes bravery to go on a trial.
It really does. Yeah.
It does. In my own case, I saw it as a real opportunity. I had the standard of care option, which I had a guidance timeline of about 18 months.
Yeah.
Maybe a little bit more, because I was only 46, not 70.
Yeah.
But I had real hope that the immunotherapy would be the way forward and would serve me well, which it has done.
And there was a few arms then. What's an arm of a trial from your perspective? Because that's
Yeah.
anyone listening now who maybe is a patient and they're thinking about clinical trials. This is all new terminology. So from your perspective, do you want to talk about that?
Sure, yeah. So I still remember the name of the clinical trial was Checkmate 227. And it was a combination of 2 immunotherapy drugs and chemotherapy. And in the various arms, you had different combinations. So you could have immunotherapy on its own, you could have immunotherapy and chemotherapy, or you could have the 2 immunotherapy drugs. And luckily enough, I was selected on the one with the 2 immunotherapy drugs.
Wow. So did you feel lucky to get, well, you obviously did. Or did you wouldn't have known?
I didn't really know.
So that's the thing, it's blinded, is it?
Yeah,
On the trial
yeah,
you're on? So
yeah.
that means you wouldn't know what you're getting.
Well, I knew I was on the immunotherapy,
Yeah.
but I didn't know whether or not the expected performance of the two immunotherapy drugs was better or worse than any of the other arms.
Yeah. So that's a tricky one to explain, Seamus, maybe when you're
Yes.
consenting a patient onto a clinical trial, the difference between the arms and, you know.
Basically, you're talking about chemotherapy-free treatment, which is a big concept in oncology, and one which has been tried in say for some breast cancer subtypes and hasn't been as successful. In ways I think we, certainly as clinicians, we would view it as a holy grail. That people wouldn't have the side effects of chemotherapy treatment. But I think I remember going back to that time, marveling at the notion of that regimen as a patient in patients with lung cancer, and what it would yield if it was successful, what impact it would have. Would be
It's one of those ones, I suppose,
substantial.
you remember where you were when the results were on some of these trials. You always, there are big conferences where all of the doctors go and these results are announced, and there was great excitement around that time, wasn't there?
Yes.
With all of these treatments, the immunotherapies in particular.
I think that we've known for some time that melanoma responds to immunotherapy. I think that there was a wrestling, and kidney cancer responds to immunotherapy, but there was a wrestling of how to harness the immune system. And then there, in cancer parlance, we talk about hot tumours and cold tumours for immunotherapy. And I guess the first stage is finding who the hot tumours are, and how to activate the immune system against it.
Now we know the lingo. I didn't know that. So okay.
And then now the move now is how to make cold tumours hot.
Okay.
And what can be done, what drugs you can add to basically to prime our cells, so that cancer cells, so that they're sensitive to immunotherapy.
And isn't it as well sometimes radiotherapy that you combine with immunotherapy? So sometimes you could be asked to go on a trial where you get both. It's not just which is interesting.
So these multiple combinations. In 2019 there were 2,000 trials registered with the FDA of immunotherapy drugs of the type that Seamus was on.
Wow.
And that's growing exponentially. An article at the beginning of the year showed that there were 160 antibody drug conjugates available that were in clinical development at the moment, and each of them will need a trial, and we'll be looking for the success stories of the future. There's a trial called the Begonia trial in breast cancer, where they're combining immunotherapy like Seamus received and these antibody drug conjugate drugs to look at making, and the ambition is that the antibody drug conjugate will make a cold tumour hot.
Wow. That's very exciting for patients listening at home, and of course we want to be in the middle of that in Cancer Trials Ireland and running those trials here. And I suppose one of the most important things when you're volunteering to go on a trial, because you are volunteering, no one's paying you to do it. It's you're doing it first of all for yourself, but also very often there's a kind of a civic duty piece where people feel, well, this is going to help, and I've heard you say that this will help research.
Yeah. Well, that's right. You've no guarantees.
Yeah.
But you are following your best hope, and if the guarantee doesn't come through, then you know that you're maybe a small part of a bigger study that's eventually going to help patients in general.
And there is always the opt-out for. Do you want to talk a little bit about that as a patient?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I suppose the actual induction onto the trial itself, there was a lot of discussions. There was a lot of paperwork that we went through.
And who did you go through that with mostly in the clinic?
So it was actually the clinical trial team, the
Yeah.
nurses in Galway University Hospital, where I went for the
We
treatment.
have to give a shout out to the nurses in Galway.
Absolutely.
And
yeah,
the doctors,
yeah,
and
yeah.
the doctors, of course, but amazing team.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So we went through the whole consent process, and I signed on. I understood in terms of what was documented, what the side effects were, what the benefits could be, and so on, and how the trial itself would be run and documented as time went on.
And then if at any point you didn't want to continue, you had that right to leave if you needed to.
At any stage.
And that can
yeah.
be important, even if you never do, just to know
Yeah, yeah.
when you're going in. And did you ever consider opting out? Is that a...
I would have one time only, and that was when I was quite sick. I did have some side effects. It wasn't a dream coast
Yeah.
from start to finish.
This isn't like taking a Panadol or a...
No,
I probably shouldn't
no.
say that, but...
Yeah. So
Yeah.
so the trial itself
Yeah.
was scheduled treatment for 2 years, and I now know that with immunotherapy, a lot of the side effects become evident in the first 6 months or so.
Okay.
The first side effect that I had was my thyroid went hyper and hypo,
Okay.
so I'm medicated for that. But the more serious side effect is that I got adrenal insufficiency. And that means that my adrenal gland doesn't produce the stress hormone cortisol. So I'm medicated for that for the rest of my life. But it's quite a serious condition, but it's manageable. But the diagnosis of that was quite an emergency case.
Yeah.
I was due to travel for a CT scan to Galway, but I was too ill to go for the scan, and instead we went directly to the A&E. But before we went to the A&E, we rang ahead and spoke to the clinical trial team.
Yeah. It's amazing to have that.
Absolutely, because they kind of paved the way for us when we got there. And once we got in, some blood tests were taken very quickly, and they kind of managed and monitored the situation along with us and the E&A team, the emergency team. The bloods revealed the low levels of cortisol, and the doctor there in the department realized what the condition was, and put me on a drip that really saved my life at that time. But that at that point it was a question of, well, is this it?
Yeah.
Is there more to come? What should I do next?
Yeah.
Should I continue on the treatment or should I stop?
Yeah. And that's a fair question to have when you go through an experience like that. When you look back on it now, when we started this conversation, we said brave. There's an element of bravery there to stick with it.
Sure,
Yeah.
sure. Again, you have to. I'm making the decision for me and my family. What's the best thing to do? I could come off it, but again, I'd be back to standard of care.
Yeah.
I think the positive thing about the trial that I was on was that the feedback, the monitoring by the clinical trial team was really first class. And I think in the first period, I was getting a CT scan every 6 weeks, and then it moved to every 12 weeks. But the terminology used in the feedback from those scans was always a little bit positive.
Yeah.
That there was improvements, there was a reduction in size and so on. And that itself gave me hope, gave me further hope, to stay on the trial, stick with it, and the outcome would be
that
good.
Communication's really important so that you know how it's going in a
Yeah,
way.
yeah.
Obviously not in detail, but just that risk benefit piece is really important from the clinician and the patient's perspective, isn't it? 'Cause
Yeah, I think that was where the conversation happened with Paul Donlan in terms of the autoimmune, teasing out about the colitis and that you might have had before. I think that it's one of the problems we see with immunotherapy drugs is these long-term side effects, and which can be very challenging to deal with, frankly, and I think that's an issue when people suffer life-threatening side effects from these agents. That mightn't be easily treated or easily dealt with. It's also a reason why we need to do more clinical trials, because we see that these drugs work and are transformative for cancer, but we also need to see that they, what we call the therapeutic ratio, that the side effect benefit, the risk, the benefits versus side effects, that needs to be tighter. That we need to refine the treatments more, and that's what Cancer Trials Ireland is about.
Absolutely. And then, like, in terms of, when you talked about, you rang ahead to the cancer clinical trials team in Galway on the way to A&E, there is a sense of, there are more people looking at you as a patient when you're on a trial than when you're not, and you get a sense of that from what Seamus said. But that's there's a lot of people around you, like from a nurse to a data person to isn't there, Seamus, when you're on a trial?
Yes, and there's also another layer as well, because there's the sponsor of the trial also has a network of patients. I mean, your trial probably had several thousand patients on it, so there's the learning from those patients as well. And when side effects develop, you have access to that network. You contact the medical person assigned to the study by the sponsor, and they then have a network of contacts to say, well, this happened in other cases, and this is what works, and this is what didn't work. So that level of support, particularly when people can be very unwell with side effects from newer agents where there's less experience with it, is enormously helpful.
Yeah. And then, like, from Cancer Trials Ireland point of view, when what we call sponsor, so when we bring a clinical trial to Ireland and we're running it, we have 60 people in our office, and half of them are out in the hospitals checking what's been done to individuals on a trial and to ensure that we've adhered to everything that we were. So there's a lot of auditing of the activity of the trial that happens from a range of people. The Health Products Regulatory Agency is another one. Did you have a sense of any of that, Seamus, when you were on the trial? Like, the people around you who were working on the trial, did you feel that sense of?
I didn't know it, but I did have the sense of it, because the trials team locally were very diligent, obviously. They constantly asked me how I was, if I had anything to tell them or that. But I also had health questionnaires on every second visit, I would say. I was on 2 weekly treatment cycles, so I think every second visit I had a health questionnaire. One of the registrars would come and talk to me on every visit, and sit down and discuss what the feedback was and if I had anything that I wanted to highlight.
Yeah.
So it was really close.
Yeah.
And obviously all that paperwork that was being created was going someplace.
Yes. Yeah.
So
yeah.
like you said, there was thousands of others on the trial as well. So all that paperwork has to be gathered somewhere.
And I suppose our team and any team who's running a trial, it could be a pharma company, they're looking for signals. So when they gather all of the data, back, and maybe there's this trend of patients having a similar symptom, that's collated back into the overall results of the trial, and that leads to, so that information is vital, isn't it?
Yeah. Incredibly vital.
Yeah. So just then, takes back to the trial, when did you get the news of how you were after the trial? Like how had it gone? When did you get that result of the The
So,
scan.
yeah,
The scan.
the
I'm
scan.
Sure there was
yeah,
one.
yeah. So,
that you
so
really-
you're right. So I had signed up for 2 years of treatment, and hoped to be still on the trial after the 2 years. And as I said, the scans were quite frequent in the first year, every 6 weeks. There was always some kind of progression, in a positive way. But the first scan the first clear scan came after about 8 months.
Wow.
So it was really incredible to go from stage 4 lung cancer in early 2016
Yeah.
to have an all clear to be in remission in 2017.
Wow. And that's when I met you.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, yeah.
And you became an advocate as a result of that.
I guess
time.
I took my first.
So you're at international
steps
conferences now. This man is up speaking to the world about the importance of what you went through, but also patient advocacy.
Absolutely, yeah.
Do you want to tell
You
us
know,
a bit about that?
Well, I suppose a little bit is that myself and others, patients, caregivers, and scientists, we set up a patient support group and caregiver support group for lung cancer in Ireland. So it's called the Irish Lung Cancer Community. We have a website. It's the ilcc.ie. And further afield, I'm also part of, or a member of, the International Association for the Study of Lung Cancer. I've been invited to speak at a number of their annual conferences, so get to travel a little bit with that to really nice destinations.
Where was the last one?
The last
You were in
one
Singapore,
was in
weren't you?
Singapore.
Wow.
Yeah.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
To go from, in 2016, stage 4 lung cancer. I mean, it's some story, isn't it?
It's a wonderful story.
And we're so grateful that, you're talking about it. Because by talking about your experience in Singapore or in Ireland, you're going to help us do more, I think.
Yeah.
It's inspiring.
I think one of the drivers for me is the fact that lung cancer has always had a very poor outcome and poor prognosis. And when I was sick, I didn't meet one other patient that had lung cancer.
Wow.
So over the 2 years. And part of what I'm doing now is to address that, have a place for, people to ask some questions, to talk to each other, and sometimes to compare notes and maybe give solutions to each other.
Yeah. Because there's only so much, Seamus, Professor O'Reilly, there's only so much that a patient can glean from the appointments that they have within the hospital.
Yes.
So I was at a conference last week where an immunotherapist, I think, said that PPI, which is patient public engagement, where we get patients together to talk about experiences, actually boosts the immune system. So I don't know how true that is, but in terms of how important it is for patients' wellness to learn from other patients. You've done some work on this recently with metastatic.
Yes, a wise patient told me that cancer is a lonely illness, but for every cancer we treat, if your mental health is better, your outcome is better, and reducing the isolation with illness is an important feature. I think the other thing is how much we can learn, like the comments that are said about screening, for instance, the insights into how things could be done better or not at all. In Canada, they have a tremendous PPI movement, and the number of patients going on clinical trials has increased significantly. Yeah. We're involved in a group designing a breast cancer study at the moment, and the insights of the patients at a 1-hour meeting with them in terms of the trial design and how it could be made better, and what would be more relevant and what the priorities were for them. That was very insightful for us. I mean, I think your lung cancer community is an example of why these things are so important to patients, and they elevate care. I mean, I think that they elevate care. It's a rising tide that lifts all boats to have that involvement. I think we as a caring healthcare professions, do better because of those, because when we hear those voices. I think also we can achieve more by having those voices. I mean, there's nothing more effective than at a meeting having someone with a lived experience when you're trying to persuade other people that you need to advance these things. And having someone there with the lived experience it gives great credibility and often and it humanises the issues that you're trying to deal with.
Absolutely. And we have one of your colleagues on our Patient Consultants Committee in Cancer Trials Ireland, Siobhan Gaynor, has led a study along with you, Seamus, in the experiences of patients with metastatic breast cancer. Mm-hmm. And what's happening next week with that study?
Siobhan Gaynor has led a study in Ireland where we've looked at the needs of patients with metastatic breast cancer and how we are addressing them. And there were 2 public presentations about this work related to communication and related to financial and time burdens of living with metastatic breast cancer. And then next week in Chicago, there are 2 additional presentations, a summary of the results, which Siobhan is presenting, and then Yvonne O'Mara, who is involved in this is leading our discussion about intimacy issues with patients. So we've highlighted a number of areas in the studies highlighted a number of areas where things could be done better. Mm-hmm. And we have a 10-point plan that has been made from that, a 10-point infogram basically, because that's how information is conveyed nowadays and that's how it's registered. And the ambition is to take that to the Cancer Control Programme to look at how we can improve care then in our hospitals for patients with metastatic breast cancer.
And what's amazing about what you've done, Seamus, for the lung cancer community, and what Siobhan, and there are many others in our patient involvement committee, is that it's really about listening to the patients and leading, like Siobhan is leading this trial through Cancer Trials Ireland, which will be a game changer. And I suppose for anyone who maybe has dialed into this webinar who might be living with a metastatic condition, it might be interesting to have a look at our website. ASCO is the big conference in Chicago next week. I call it the Oscars for cancer research, because when you're a patient and you have a difficult diagnosis and you're living longer, but you're still waiting for that big treatment, there's often, and I was privileged to be in the room 2 years ago when an announcement about a treatment in breast cancer happened, and I saw people crying in the room and getting emotional because they knew what it meant for the patients out there. It knew it meant this was going to save more lives, and it's really, really phenomenal. So we talk about it like, you know, it's our job, but this is it's incredible. So keep an eye out for that in June. Now I think we've gone through a lot of what your experience has been on a trial, Seamus, and Professor O'Reilly in a leadership role in a clinical trials organisation. Now we want to kind of get a sense of the questions that might be coming in through the webinar. So time is, the first question is, time is of the essence for aggressive cancers. How is the clinical trial selection process managed in these situations, i.e. the screening? It's a really good question, the screening timeline.
So the screening timelines are take this into account in terms of the time to treatment. The other thing is that there are guidelines for us in terms of when we need to start treatment when someone has an aggressive cancer. So if you have a clinical trial that's looking at patients where they're in that subset, then that trial ethically, and it won't get passed, you won't be allowed to enroll patients, has to have that built into it.
Okay, can I just ask on that? So if you're on a trial where there's an obvious advantage to one of the arms on the trial, what happens then eventually to the patients on the other arms?
So there's a data safety and monitoring committee that review the study as it's going along, and they review it independently of the sponsors and of the clinicians, and they have access to the unblinded data in the trial, because the trial may often be blinded where people aren't sure what treatment they're getting, to prevent bias, and that data safety have the power to stop the trial.
Okay.
And then there's a thing called crossover, where if one arm is better than another, oftentimes the trial will have a crossover arm where you can go where the trial stops and people go to the new treatment.
So we have seen that in trials here in Ireland, and it's,
Yes.
it's good as a patient to know that that's there, that possibility can be there. Do all the arms in a trial have treatment potential?
So sometimes there's what we call a placebo arm, where we're not sure if the treatment makes any difference or not. And sometimes there are trials where it's unethical to have a no treatment arm, but there are other trials where there's uncertainty. For instance, say, does aspirin prevent cancer, for instance? So that's the aspirin trial, where you might have side effects of aspirin that would outweigh its benefits, such as bleeding or tummy upset. So in those trials, it's ethical to have a placebo arm where we're not sure.
Yeah.
And we will never know unless we do have the arm.
And the risk is it's different because we can't say aspirin cures cancer. So
Yes.
if you're not on it, but if it's say it's a chemotherapy versus immunotherapy, you're always going to get the best standard of care treatment in that scenario, aren't
Yes.
you? There's not really you're never going to get nothing.
No, I mean,
Yeah.
the standard of care arm has to be an effective agent.
Yeah.
It's unethical not to have
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. Great. Seamus, do you have anything to say on that?
No, I'm quite clear that for patients going on clinical trials, that the standard of care is the minimum treatment that they'll receive, that everything else, every other arm is moving forward and getting better.
Yeah, great.
Yeah.
And I suppose when we hear about the aspirin trial is a really good example. So this is where if you add aspirin, you could prevent a particular cancer. And actually, it's one of those drugs that it's very easy to get. But it's not one that has a huge commercial interest. So you're really reliant on groups like ours, not-for-profit groups, to run those clinical trials. We are nearly finished a clinical trial with University College London, which is the aspirin trial. And we'd like to be able to, and you often hear about things like what you can eat to prevent or help with a cancer diagnosis, or physiotherapy that's good in those scenarios. And those are the kinds of trials we like to do as well, that aren't necessarily high-cost pharmaceuticals. So we have
a few questions about the availability of trials, so they're all of a piece, but we'll just scan them.
Okay. So there's a few questions, I'm told, coming in about the availability of trials in Ireland. I think it's fair to say we took a hit during COVID, and the ransomware attack was nearly worse for us in the context of clinical trials. And this year, we're on the cusp of a wave now, and we have all of our ducks in a row. I think in Irish hospitals, Seamus, for trials, we have more trials opening this year than we had last year.
Yes.
For example.
And our staffing in our units has improved. I mean, with COVID finishing, many people found the world opened up to them again. So there were significant issues with staffing, and that has regularised itself somewhat, although the embargo isn't helping. The recruitment embargo in healthcare at the moment. So there has been a stabilisation, and I think also with COVID and the cyber attack, the other thing that we're affected is the energy of the people to pursue clinical trials, but also networking. The networking that comes with meeting people at conferences and meetings that was disrupted by COVID. So it's great that that's gone.
Because clinical trials, you can't run them in isolation of the rest of the world.
No.
We have to work globally, and we do. A lot of our trials have either been conceived outside of Ireland or we've been part of it, but they're very much global. So to do that, you need to be in a room, and you've often, I've seen you in rooms with international professors coming up with a new idea for a clinical trial together in breast cancer.
I think, and it's that, like everything in life, it's often it's the unconstructed interaction that often is the most productive. And I think that also for our younger investigators, the building their network, retaining a network which will allow new trials and new ideas to come into the country, is also important as well. That succession piece that we need in terms of continuing to develop the trials network we have here, because the amount of discovery that's out there is substantial and growing exponentially. And unless we have people, and unless we have staffing and people with time to allow us to develop those, that give them that space as they develop their careers, that's a really important piece.
Absolutely. And Seamus, just from your point of view, when you access a trial, how important is it to have it near home?
It's really important. You know, if you have to travel for a trial, you have so many additional costs. You have the difficulty of traveling while you're ill, and so on. So to have it at least in your own region, you know, is a phenomenal benefit.
Because we were really good in Ireland at one point of having, so someone has asked online about where are the trials and what trials are we running. So all our trials are on cancertrials.ie. We've listed them all the different disease areas, but they don't all run in Galway. And they you know, we had a better track record there. I suppose that geographical spread of trials is important. And we've talked about that. You've helped me advocate on this in this space before, Seamus.
So I'd say, you know, it's important that especially for patients of the west of Ireland, you know, that Cancer Trials Ireland and others are able to bring trials to the hospitals, so that, you know, someone from Donegal doesn't have to travel to Dublin, you know, because
if you're in Inishowen, your hospital is Galway, isn't it? And that's a 4-hour drive.
Exactly.
So we're with you. And if anyone is online from Galway and from Donegal, we do get that, and we are advocating for that in Cancer Trials Ireland, that need to access. And it's no one's fault in the hospital. It's more we need to look at the structure and the infrastructure around it. And that's something we really feel strongly about. Now, it doesn't. The fact that Seamus is from Galway and I have a Mayo father has nothing to do with that, and you're from Clare. But it's something that's on all of our agendas, because it's a massive part of the country.
Well, equity is a very important part of how we work and how we function, and it's important that we have equity.
Absolutely. So there's some more questions here. Any plans to join ongoing or future EU trials on metastatic uveal melanoma? Existing therapies have shown poor outcomes and survival rates are low. Thanks. So that's a very specific question. I'm going to hand to Prof. O'Reilly. I know we do work with European groups like EORTC, Seamus, and which is the European Cancer Trials Organisation. And we've worked with global melanoma trials, but at the moment, I don't know about that one.
I think there's a unit in Southampton in Southampton, I think, or Plymouth, that we refer patients to for treatment. As part of that, it's what we term a rare tumour in terms of the number of patients with it. But rare tumours are real tumours for patients that are affected. But it's why we need these global networks and to be involved in these larger networks in order to allow for a trial access. I know that Seamus is going to a meeting in Madrid later today, and one of it is a project, a real world data project, and I think this is where these large European funded networks with real world data can really be transformative for these rare tumours. I think that's. But it's obviously we're also fortunate that we have someone sitting beside us here today who is, you know, who's embedded in establishing these things which will benefit all patients.
We're very lucky to have him doing that for us. And in the context of that person, because I'm imagining they're dealing with that tumour at the minute, should they talk to their oncologist about Southampton and maybe even if they drop one of us an email in Cancer Trials Ireland, we might be able to extend on the network, because it's important to say not everyone working in cancer is working in clinical trials. So if you are seeing an oncologist or a surgeon and you know there's a trial happening in Dublin but it's maybe not happening in Galway, referral happens in that scenario,
Yes.
doesn't it, Seamus? Yeah.
I mean, we have our disease-specific groups, and then there are networks of WhatsApp groups for the lung cancer community, for the breast community, where there's that cross-talk about what's available and what issues are there.
Yeah. So you can now. I know there was a question that came in because I'm thinking about Southampton and saying, oh, we can refer there, but it is tricky to refer cross-border to a clinical trial. So I know if you're from the north of Ireland and you come down here to become part of a clinical trial here, it's actually the one thing that was left out of the Brexit protocol. The one area that was left out was clinical trials. So there isn't really do you want to talk about that as well? We're looking at trying to build an infrastructure around that cross-border access.
So I think this is a bit like a Rubik's Cube, where there's multiple moving parts, and if you move one, you move another one. So Professor Maeve Lowry from St James's has been involved in the Peace Plus grant, which will look at cross-border referral for rare tumour types, looking at specific targeted therapies and interacting with Professor Vicky Coyle in the Belfast Cancer Centre. And I think that's a very good exemplar of what's needed. And it's in listening to Professor Lowry present her grant application. It's not a straightforward thing. And I think part of the challenge for the medical community is moving all these pieces in a coherent way, because oftentimes there can be bureaucracy present which wasn't meant to obstruct, but is there and is very difficult to unlock.
Because when you go back to that patient I talked about earlier in Inishowen Peninsula, I mean, they're less than an hour from Derry, from Athnagavlin Hospital. So if we had cross-border arrangements where patients from the border area could go to the north and be on a trial, or vice versa, we've been because at the minute I think you're really reliant on your own private health insurance. And that's another big conversation for another forum. So just the next question then is there clinical trials for endometrial cancer? And again, I would suggest there is. There are some on our website, clinical trials. We've a fantastic leader in the gynae cancers from also based in your site, I think, Seamus?
Yes, Dr. Derval Collins is and now Professor Karen Cadu and Sharon O'Toole. So a trinity of very engaged and active investigators, and we have very good links with the NGOT group, which are instrumental in gynecologic oncology trials. So I would agree, check the website.
Yeah, absolutely. And if they're not there, there are more. They're always coming, and it's a very difficult area, and I know that. Is the clinician consultant the one who decides whether to offer a patient a clinical trial? That's a really good question. I might get both of you to answer this one.
Okay, I'll start.
Please.
So in my case, yes, it was the consultant who offered me the clinical trial. When you're in that situation, you are you know nothing. You're coming into a whole new area. And you're unaware of what are the possibilities out there. What I would say nowadays, with campaigns like Cancer Trials Ireland have, with the Just Ask campaign, and with groups like my own, the Irish lung cancer community, we're there to support people and encourage them to check what other options may be there for them, and discuss those with their clinicians.
So that's the Just Ask.
That's the Just
That's
Ask.
why we're here.
That's
So
why we're
we
here.
say
Yeah.
bring it into the clinician and talk about it.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that's happening.
Yeah.
We're making everybody ask, Seamus, so I think they are. Yeah.
I know that's important.
Yeah.
I think it's the enthusiasm of the clinician is also pivotal in terms of trials. I think that's and that's part of our role here to make to get clinicians involved, to get the newer generation of people coming in who are starting their careers to get involved, to get our trainees to be involved. So With Siobhan Gaynor's trial, there were two trainees on the steering committee, and Martin Sweeney is rolling out, who's also involved in our patient committee, is developing a similar study for prostate cancer, and again there are trainees embedded in that as well.
Yeah, which is great. And I think the next question again is very much around inflammatory breast cancer. Are there any clinical trials in Ireland or the UK asking for, this is a person who's asking for their sister who's in Liverpool. That's interesting though. I'm assuming the sister is probably Irish, so in that scenario, if there's a trial here, I'm sure,
so
don't quote me, but
the Clatterbridge is one of the biggest cancer centres in the UK. So inflammatory breast cancer is a subtype of breast cancer, and so normally we would treat the underlying cancer that's involved with it. So that could be either, there are three subtypes of breast cancer basically, and the treatment would be directed at that. Running a trial specifically for inflammatory breast cancer would be challenging because of the number of patients that you would actually, the number of patients that a centre would see in a year would be
so
a handful.
Good chance in Liverpool because it's a big centre, and if it's there, if it's going to be anywhere, likely to be there. Even though we do work a lot with the UK on trials. Any trials going on for angiosarcoma in the north or south?
Not that I'm aware of, specifically, no.
Yeah, so Vincent's is St Vincent's, isn't it, the centre
sarcoma
of expertise? And again, if there are, we'll be putting them on our website. And I know that the UCD Cancer Trials Network, which I think cover a lot of the sarcoma trials, some in Cork as well, would have a website of their trials as well. So this will probably be the last question. What will the impact on participants and their safety in the AI introduction? Artificial intelligence is the buzzword question in every one of these health forums. So let's go. So we're never going to replace how we do trials right now with artificial intelligence yet.
Correct.
But is it coming?
I think artificial intelligence has tremendous potential because it has the ability to see things that the naked eye can't see, for instance, in pathology specimens. So one of the things that they're looking at is determining prognosis by artificial intelligence review of breast cancer slides, for instance. And
this is your scan. You go for a scan and artificial, is that right?
The pathology microscope slide.
Yeah.
And one of the problems we have in our clinics is patients with lung nodules where they need multiple scans to make sure it's going in the right direction or not anything to worry about. That terrifies patients. It means that when we need to scan patients, we can't because we have all of these patients who are getting scanned. So artificial intelligence, I think, will do a lot in terms of analysing those scans to say no further follow-up is needed or follow-up is needed. And I think to go back to the most important person here, I think that in the future, artificial intelligence may also have determined what chance decided your treatment, but artificial intelligence might decide it in the future to say, this is the regimen. Your regimen, from what I can gather, was immunotherapy, pure immunotherapy, but it may be that some subsets benefit from chemotherapy and immunotherapy, and that would be decided ahead of, that algorithm could be decided. So I obviously there's concerns about the misuse of artificial intelligence, but I think it has tremendous potential for benefit for patients, for treatment selection for patients, and ultimately for patient outcomes.
Have you any thoughts on that?
I absolutely do.
I think you would. Yeah.
I think the possibilities are endless with artificial intelligence, and what we could possibly expect in the future from artificial intelligence is that those scans that are reviewed by artificial intelligence, along with a person's other demographics, their medical history, their age, their location, can be used to even predict cancers or particular cases. You know, it's kind of an extension of what Professor O'Reilly mentioned, but if everybody in the country had regular CT scans, you know, every 2 to 3 years, it would enable better predictions of cancers. So there's lots of scope there.
So prevention, it could become really important. And I suppose it's something we shouldn't shy away from, because the right actors need to be involved in artificial intelligence, and not the good actors, not the bad ones. So it's certainly so. I know when I've seen in the US where you're comparing to, say you have two arms, where there's a standard of care arm in countries where they have electronic health registries and they have access to data and they have access to patients' experience on particular drugs, they're able to use that through AI potentially as the silent arm. So you actually don't have to put any patients on. It's in the future, but that would be hugely beneficial for patients going on a trial, because you'd know I'm going to be recruited onto the experimental arm, because the data required for the other arm can be pulled. We will never be there if we don't have an electronic health registry in this country, and that's a big area that we'll advocate for, and probably another webinar. So I think we've had great engagement. We've had loads of questions coming in, and I'm sorry if we didn't get to answer all of them specifically. I think everyone will agree we had a great panel. The Seamus double act, two Seamuses, Professor Seamus O'Reilly from Cork, and who's our clinical lead, and Seamus Cotter from Clare. It's very important to say that, but representing the Galway site and the brilliance of the Galway site today. And we also want to thank the people that enable Cancer Trials Ireland to be here, are all of the clinicians out at site, all of the nurses, all of the data managers. Some of them I know have dialed in on their lunch break today. We're a great team of people who are really driven by one goal. It's to be that word indispensable that I think you crafted, to be indispensable to you, but also to Irish cancer patients. And if you are a patient who has listened to this, you know, we're here. We're doing everything we can to bring more trials to you. And we're doing it because we've got the trust from the Health Research Board, which is funded by the Irish government through the Department of Health. The Irish Cancer Society have been astonishingly generous to us over the years. We have a 3-year commitment of 1 million a year, where they fund our activity in clinical trials. Philanthropy, through people like the Friends of Pat Smullen and many others, Property Picnic, which happened last week, all raising money in honour of friends who have passed with cancer. And all of this is leading to our ability to do more and drive more. So lots more to come, we hope. And mind yourselves, look after yourselves, and get in touch with us if you've got any more questions.